About a year ago, I learned about the Citizens Climate Lobby, and their main purpose is to lobby the government to do something about climate change, and also to educate the public. So I joined the local group and have been attending some of their meetings, and I'm really impressed with this group and what they do. And Sudhanshu Jain is the leader of this group. He takes it seriously. He quit his job so that he could be a full-time activist. So, Sudhanshu Jain.
Okay. Let me get away from the speakers. Okay. All right, everyone can hear me? Well, happy Mother's Day. I've been a member of the Humanist community, this chapter, for probably about 15 or 17 years. And then I had a son. My son, Anand, there is 13 years old, and that derailed a lot of things. And so I'm pleased to be back here. Some of you may have attended this lecture about a year ago. Can I get a show of hands of who might have seen this? Okay. So some of this is going to be a little bit of a repeat because I'm going over denialism. And Mark, I wasn't at this lecture, but I reviewed the slides. And so we'll be talking about, one of the things you'll see in the program is that I went to MIT, and this presentation may be like an education at MIT, which is sort of like drinking from a fire hose. So tell me if I'm going too fast, because I tend to do that, okay? I get most of my information from this book, and let me read what the grist has to say in the back. This book came out in 2010, Merchants of Doubt, and she parallels the denial that occurred for acid rain, the ozone hole, tobacco and cancer, DDT, and now global warming. So this is what the grist says about it. If you read just one book on climate change this year, read Merchants of Doubt. And if you have time to read two, reread Merchants of Doubt. Okay? This is an unbelievable book. And most of the information that I get here is from reading this book several times. One thing I want to point out is that these characters, they're physicists. I mean, Fred Seitz worked on the Manhattan Project. He was the president of the National Academies of Science. So we have these people with these incredible bona fides who appear over and over again in almost every one of these denial campaigns. And I will actually explain why these super bright people are in this business of denial. So I'm not going to talk about the reasons for climate change. If we rehash that, then we're giving in to the deniers. So basically, 98% of people that publish and work in climate science believe that climate science is real and it's caused by humans. And the parallel that I tell people is that if you had cancer and you went to 100 doctors and 98 of them said you needed surgery and 2 of them said, oh, it's a slow-growing cancer, I've seen this go away before, or it's not going to kill you, I'm not sure, I would go with the surgery. So I don't think we should give a lot of voice to these 2% of people. Both the American Association for the Advancement of Science and the National Academy have come out fairly strongly about human-caused global warming. You can't actually even see this. There's a little line right here, which is the 24 papers that clearly reject global warming or endorse a cause other than CO2. So of the almost 14,000 peer-reviewed papers, 0.17% argued for the opposite case. Most countries have national academies of science, and these are very prestigious organizations. For the American one, you have to get invited to it. You don't just join. So it's very, very prestigious. All of these national academies of science confirm that humans are causing global warming. This is the number of national academies around the world that deny climate change. Okay? So we have this parallel. In fact, I was surprised to hear that as far back as the 1930s, Germans found a statistical relationship between cancer and smoking. Okay, this is how far back it goes. And then in 1954, the UK Medical Research Council confirmed the link between smoking and cancer. The first law that was passed in the US, so it took 10 years for the Surgeon General to say anything, and then it took until 1975 when Minnesota enacted the first law that created a non-smoking zone in a restaurant, which means that people would be affected by passive smoke. Okay, so it took us, 21 years before we pretty much did anything about it. And the reason is that we had this very active campaign by the tobacco companies to create doubt. In fact, they say, doubt is our product, a cigarette executive once observed, since it is the best means of competing with the body of fact that exists in the minds of the general public. It is also a means of establishing controversy. So this is the merchants of doubt. This is what they sell. They will continually say, oh, well, my grandmother lived to 100 and she smoked 3 packs of cigarette. Well, that's per day, and that's a statistical outlier. So if you go by statistics, it's very clear. There is a direct link between smoking and cancer, but you can always find these outliers, and people that don't understand the science or the math or the scientific process keep rehashing these worn out arguments. In 1949, we established this thing called the Fairness Doctrine in media, and what it said that broadcast journalists were required to dedicate airtime to controversial issues in a balanced manner. Okay, so a lot of people interpreted that as equal time, but there's no way it should be equal time. We should not be allowing these people to promote these myths, because what happens is you promote a myth often enough and it sticks in people's minds. People become accustomed to that as being, well, if everyone's saying this, it must be true. So we should not give any voice to these people. I mean, we would not give as much time to Hitler's views as to Churchill's views, right? It just doesn't make sense. So here's an example. A review of publications at UCSF looked at newspaper and magazine articles on passive tobacco smoke. And between 1992 and 1994, 62% of them, the articles, still said that it was controversial. Okay? And that's because these merchants of doubt keep trying to convince you that it's controversial. Okay? I'm going to, you guys have all heard of ice cores. This is one of my favorite graphs. This top one is methane levels, this is temperature, and this is CO2 concentrations. So when you look at temperature, these bottom parts are ice ages, and these are interglacials. So the last interglacial was 120,000 years ago. That was the Eemian, and this is what the temperature was, and this is what the CO2 level is. Well, the CO2 level never got above 300 parts per million. We're just this week crossed 400 parts per million. So we're out of the range of multiple ice ages. So it's kind of scary. So this is a number. Bill McKibben is the founder of 350.org, and Jerry is wearing a button for 350. Every time you see him, he's wearing his 350 button. So Bill McKibben wrote an article in Rolling Stone magazine talking about these numbers that you really need to remember, okay? So 2 degrees centigrade is pretty much the limit of what temperature rise should be from pre-industrial temperatures. So if we go above 2 degrees, there is no guarantee that the poles won't completely melt, okay? This was the number established during the Copenhagen Climate Conference in 2009. So that's the number. We're now at 1 degree C, so we're halfway there, okay? We're currently emitting 32 billion tons of CO2 in the atmosphere worldwide every year. In order to stay below 2 degrees, this is about what the atmosphere can take. Okay, a lot of this carbon dioxide gets absorbed by the oceans, which is why we've been emitting a lot of CO2, but the levels haven't gone up as much as you would expect because the oceans absorb a lot of that CO2 and absorb a lot of the temperature. So if you just do the simple math of this is what we're emitting, this is what our limit is, that means that we have basically 18 years to get completely off of carbon, okay? That is not very much time. This is what the fossil fuel companies know about. Their stock values depend on the fact that they know how to sell you this much carbon, okay? Well, if you think about it, that's 5 times what our limit is. So what does that mean? They can't burn it. It is unconscionable for them to burn what they know about, okay? And we need to do something to basically limit their access to this carbon, which includes the tar sands in Canada. It includes, you know, all this exploration that they're doing. So there are universities and pension funds that are starting to divest in some of these fossil fuel companies. And the reason is that if we pass a law limiting their ability to burn that, their stock will plummet. So shareholders will lose value. So it's almost a preemptive move to divest of these fossil fuel companies. So what is kind of scary is that it actually takes a long time for the CO2 to leave the atmosphere. Okay, more than half of the CO2 is removed within 100 years, but a quarter will still be here 10,000 years from now, okay? Which means that there's this imbalance of CO2 in the atmosphere which is trapping heat. So it takes so long to remove, there's a net balance of about 1 watt per square meter hitting the planet that's not being radiated because we have these heat trapping greenhouse gases. And so since that gas remains there, it continues to add extra heat to the planet and continues to warm the planet. So if we stop today, we would still be raising the temperature of the planet, okay? Which is why it's so urgent to stop today. I just wanted to remind you of this because I'm going to talk about the denial campaign. So these tobacco companies would have these ads like this talking about how many doctors would smoke cigarettes, right? And they were continually talking about, you know, putting ads on TV talking about doctors smoking, so these are the types of campaigns they were running, and it was incredibly successful. For 21 years, we didn't do anything, right? Here's another crazy thing that these deniers have attacked. So we stopped using DDT because mosquitoes were resistant, okay? That is a fact, but it is a fact that is being denied. People have accused Rachel Carson of being a mass murderer because when we stopped using DDT, more people got malaria because the mosquitoes, okay, it's very complicated. We use DDT, and if you look in Sri Lanka, in 1948 we had 2.8 million cases of malaria. Then we started using DDT. In 1963 we only had 17 cases of malaria, okay? But then in 1968 malaria flared up, and in 1969 we had 2.5 million cases of malaria. Okay, but the DDT couldn't control it. I mean, we kept dumping more and more DDT in the atmosphere, in the environment, and yet we still had almost the same number of cases. Now the population had increased, but the DDT clearly wasn't working, okay? Now people are saying, oh, well, these 2.5 million, you know, there are a lot of people died, and Rachel Carson has that blood on her hands because she's responsible for that all these people died of malaria, which is not true at all, okay? But you will see that even John Tierney of the New York Times, he picked this up, and it spread like wildfire, okay? And I actually quoted that for a little while until I read Silent Spring, and Silent Spring, because we just had the 50th anniversary of Silent Spring. It's an incredible book. I mean, you have to read that book. Okay? So this is Denialism. It's, you can't really see this, but this is the Exxonmobil, this brown, dark brown line. This is the Koch foundations of how much money they've put into Denialism. And then this is Donors Trust, which is now this sort of super secret, after Citizens United, these wealthy people and corporations are able to put anonymous money into campaigns and into promoting legislation. So you can see that the amount has been increasing over time. And it's actually, frankly, just good business for these companies. It's much cheaper to pay to get legislation passed, to lobby, than it is to actually change your business models. So conservative billionaires have used secretive funding routes to channel nearly 120 million or more to 100 groups casting doubt about the science behind climate change. Okay? So Greenpeace has documented that Exxon spent $25 million to fund climate denier groups. Okay, this is what Al Gore said. Deniers are spending hundreds of millions of dollars each year on misleading advertisements in the mass media, hiring 4 anti-climate lobbyists for every member of the U.S. Senate and House of Representatives. I love this Sinclair Lewis quote. It is difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on his not understanding it. Okay. Which is very true when people are getting paychecks from the oil companies. Pardon?
Universities getting grants.
Oh, absolutely. Universities get grants. And unfortunately, when they give those grants, they are able to suppress the research. So if the results of the research come out contrary to what the funder company wanted, they would suppress the research. So it's kind of scary. You've probably heard of the Koch brothers. So the Koch brothers, they have a private company called Koch Industries. It's a private company. It has 60,000 employees. Their revenues, annual revenues, are $113 billion. Okay, most of it comes from refining and distribution of petrochemicals, energy, polymers, minerals, fertilizers. Their subsidiaries are Georgia Pacific, Invista, Flint Hills Resources, which is actually a refinery in Port Arthur, Texas, which is going to refine the Keystone Pipeline crude that comes down. So these guys have a very strong interest in supporting the Keystone Pipeline. Okay, so they don't have the best environmental record, but I'm going to get to this point, which is that their father started this company. And he ended up building 15 refineries in the Soviet Union during communism. And he became very anti-Stalin. And he became a rabid anti-communist. Okay, and that theme will come back later in the talk. Koch was assessed more than $400 million in fines, penalties, and judgments for environmental violations. So you can see that a lobbying effort would probably be cheaper than what they pay in fines and penalties. So you can see why it's good business for them to want to lobby. Koch Industries has spent more than $50 million to lobby in Washington between 2006 and 2011. That's just to lobby, okay? On the next slide, you'll see how much money they spent on politics. The Koch brothers spent up to $400 million in the 2012 elections, attempting to elect right-wing candidates to the White House, the U.S. Senate, and the U.S. House and governorships. Those efforts will continue in the future. This is from Bernie Sanders' website, Senator Bernie Sanders, my favorite senator. So he has this whole campaign, because now what the Koch brothers are doing is they're trying to buy the Chicago Tribune, the LA Times, the Baltimore Sun, and I mean, you can see when Murdoch took over the Wall Street Journal, what happened to the Wall Street Journal. I mean, it became very, very right-wing. In fact, the Wall Street Journal has promoted this idea of Rachel Carson and DDT. So that's how insidious this is. So Bernie Sanders has a campaign to stop these guys from taking over these newspapers. I mean, there are groups that are trying to stop funding for NPR. It's like, where are we going to get our independent journalism, our detailed, in-depth journalism, if we don't have the New York Times, the LA Times, Chicago Tribune? It's kind of sad. If you look at oil company profits, this is what they're trying to protect. You take the 5 big oil companies, BP, Chevron, ConocoPhillips, Exxonmobil, Shell. In 2011, they had a combined profit of $137 billion. Okay, so BP had a loss because of their spill. Okay, but other than that, they still made money in 2011. So you can see that these are the profits they're trying to maintain, and these assets, these basically unburnable carbon assets in the ground that they want to continue to keep us addicted to and keep profiting off of. So they will do whatever it takes to influence Congress to prevent climate legislation. Okay, that is how desperate they are. So here's an example of what we call the carbon bubble. This is where the valuations of these fossil fuel companies are dependent on burning that 3,000 gigatons of carbon. So if they're not allowed to burn that, then they're overvalued. That would be a bubble. Okay, so it's also called stranded assets, meaning that there's assets that they should not be allowed. It's unconscionable for us to allow them to burn that carbon. We're burning far more than what's being captured by plants, so it's building up in the environment. We just crossed 400 parts per million. So what we're saying is that 2/3 of the reserves of carbon that are in the ground have to remain underground, okay, just to meet the existing internationally agreed targets. Now, I think those international targets are still too high. We need to be completely off of carbon almost today. If these agreements hold, the reserves will be in effect unburnable and worthless. And so these are trillions of dollars of fossil fuels that cannot be burned, okay? So what's interesting is, here we are telling these people that there's these, the fossil fuels they already know about they can't burn. And yet they're spending $674 billion in 2012 to find and exploit even more resources. So they're looking for more shale oil, more oil reserves in the Arctic. I mean, it's crazy. They're denying the fact that the poles are melting, and yet they're using the fact that we have open sea lanes in the Arctic to explore for more oil. How bizarre is that? So, all right. So what's interesting is that these organizations have an active program to actually teach denial in classrooms, okay? Exxon funded the Heartland Institute to develop curriculum to go in the classroom to be balanced science, kind of like evolution and intelligent design. Not only did Exxon fund this curriculum development, but they also fund ALEC, which is passing bills to require teaching climate change denial in the schools. Okay, so I think most of you know about ALEC. ALEC is this organization that writes bills and then gives them to their favorite senators and congresspeople and basically says rubber stamp this and it will become your state law. And they've done this over and over again. And they've worked on, gun legislation, they worked on climate legislation, they worked on pollution legislation, and often what they've found is that legislation that gets passed in these states is word for word, verbatim from the ALEC documents. Okay, it's not like these Congress people thought about it or had their own legislative assistants do the research on these bills. They take it verbatim and push it through. And it's very effective. They don't have to spend any time on it. But it's actually worked because 3 states, so in January of 2013, ALEC has already planted its Environmental Literacy Improvement Act, which mandates a balanced teaching of climate science in state legislators in Oklahoma, Colorado, and Arizona. So this is just like intelligent design and evolution all over again. We know that 2008 was one of the hottest years in U.S. history. So ALEC introduced this act in 1/5 of the state houses nationwide. It's passed in 4 states, and it's incredibly scary to me. Okay, this shows that denialism actually works. Do you guys remember what Climategate was? Climategate was this case where the amount of data that's collected from satellites and weather stations is enormous. And the scientists have to distill this data down. And they use various statistical methods. And, like Mark Twain, I think, said, statistics, lies, damn lies in statistics, because you can use statistics to basically say anything you want. So these researchers were accused, and someone hacked into their email accounts and found these emails between them talking about the methods that they're using to distill this data down. And these hacked emails implied to some people that these scientists were cooking the books. They were making climate change look worse than it was. And this got all over, and these people were brought up in front of, the U.S. Congress and had to testify to defend their views. Emails were hacked in the UK at the Hadley Research Center and in the University of Pennsylvania climate science department. And so what has happened is these hacked emails got distributed all over the internet, and everyone accused these scientists of cooking the books. And this myth persists because after all of these hearings and after all of this work done in the UK and the US, these scientists were completely exonerated. There was no evidence to say that they had cooked the data to make climate change appear worse than it was. So, but here's the result of it. In 2006, this many people believe this red line, that climate change is a serious problem, that it's occurring, okay? That climate change is occurring. In 2008, it actually went up. 2010, it went down, okay? So these denial efforts to say that these scientists are cooking the books are actually incredibly effective. These companies have learned from the tobacco history and the acid rain history and the ozone history that if you just create controversy, if you create denial, you can delay any legislation. They keep their profits, and they keep people in the dark. Fortunately, I don't have the graph, but this is turning around. In 2012, I believe this line has been going up. And that's partly due to Hurricane Sandy. I mean, people were just hit in the face with this huge hurricane. So, all right, here's something that you will hear over and over again. The cycles are, the Earth always has these cycles. Yes, the Earth does have these cycles, but not since humans have been around. Okay, we had cycles, we had huge warming when dinosaurs were around, and we had mass extinctions. But that's not what we want. We don't want a cycle where, 300 million people will die because Bangladesh gets flooded, or we have hurricanes, Category 6 hurricanes. That's what we're trying to avoid, that human misery that will come from the disruptment of our planet. So here's the myth. So this is the temperature on Earth. It is increasing. It's increased 1 degree centigrade. And they say, well, it's increasing because the sun is putting out more energy. Well, here's the data. This is a satellite above the atmosphere. This measures what the sun is putting out. Here's what the sun is putting out. It cycles, but it's not going up. So this is in the troposphere. This is at the top of the atmosphere, and this is what is happening. That's because these greenhouse gases between us and the troposphere are trapping the heat. Pardon? How many years? Oh, it's 1980 to 2005. Okay, so this is degrees Fahrenheit. So it's gone up. You can see here it's gone up, say, 0.2 to 1. So since 1980, the average temperature has gone up about 0.7 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay, but if you go back to pre-industrial, it's gone up almost 2 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay, so since we started burning a lot of carbon. Okay, I don't know if you've been exposed to this concept of an externality. An externality is a cost that is not included in the price between the transaction between a producer and a consumer. Okay, so for example, if someone sells you plastic and they made that plastic by dumping all their waste into the river and they didn't pay for that, then they are able to sell you plastic for cheaper, pretty much like what's happening in China. Okay, so they're able to produce goods for very cheap because they're not paying to dispose properly of their wastes. Okay, so that's called an externality. So here's an example of an externality. Coal power is actually the cheapest kind of power, electricity that you can buy. Okay, it turns out that the burning coal releases mercury and sulfur dioxide, which is acid rain, and particulates, which cause asthma. So coal burning creates a huge amount of environmental impact. And yet the coal mining company doesn't pay for the medical bills, all the kids that have asthma. The electric company doesn't pay for all the kids that have asthma. They don't pay for the mercury poisoning. So that would be called an externality that's not incorporated in the price of the coal. So Harvard actually just did a study, and they said that if we accounted for this externality, the true cost of coal would be $500 billion a year to account for the nitrous oxide, the sulfur dioxide, the particulates, the mercury emission, okay, fatalities of members of the public due to rail accidents and mining accidents and government subsidies and all of that. So if you included that in the price of coal electricity, right now coal electricity is 7 cents a kilowatt hour, okay? The externality would be 9 to 27 cents a kilowatt hour. So it would be even more, it would more than double the price of coal if we accounted for that externality. And I think it's fair that that price be built in. Why should we have to pay to subsidize? It's effectively a subsidy for these mining companies, okay? That is one externality. And if we did that, we would get off of coal much faster than we are now. I mean, coal energy is 7 cents a kilowatt hour, wind energy is 14. If you took 7 cents and you added the 9 to that, you'd be at 16. You'd be higher than wind already. And that's at the low end of the scale, right? So you just build this externality into the price, and it makes perfect sense to get off of coal, all right? Here's another example of an externality. I think you've all heard of fracking, right? Well, fracking takes an incredible amount of water that you have to pump into the ground. And in Texas, they've basically fracked the whole state. And the amount of water that they use has to be transported by trucks. These trucks, water is very heavy. These trucks are damaging the roads. So according to the Environment Texas report, truck traffic needed to deliver water to a single fracking well causes as much damage to local roads as nearly 3.5 million car trips. Okay? So Texas has approved $40 million in funding for road repairs in the Barnett Shale region. So this is what the taxpayers are paying that's not being paid by the fracking companies. It's an externality that's not being covered. So externalities are very critical to the solution. Including externalities are very critical to dealing with pollution. Any type of pollution, whether it's carbon dioxide, mercury, pesticides. Okay, have you guys heard that it's not very healthy to eat tuna fish? Okay, I'm surprised at how few people know this, but this is from the FDA, and if you weigh 100 pounds, you should not eat more than 1 can of white albacore tuna fish every 2 weeks, okay? And the reason is that mercury is bioaccumulative. That means, yes?
Yeah, I think everybody here agrees, the deniers on the right are crazy people. That doesn't mean that...
Oh, sorry, you need the microphone. Someone can get him the microphone.
Okay. Not working. There we go. Okay, I think we all agree that, the right wing are crazy people. But that doesn't mean the left wing is right. It'd be like, somebody who is a theist, arguing that God created the universe versus somebody saying that space aliens created the universe. That doesn't make the space aliens right, We all know how evil the Koch brothers are and everything, but I'm not hearing anything about solutions to the carbon problem. And just to cut to the chase, there is no way that you can solve this without addressing population increases. You can't have 7 billion people on this planet and stop carbon increases. It can't be done. So,
well, I agree with that, but you haven't heard the end of my talk.
Okay, I'd like to see you move to the
I have solutions at the end of my talk.
Okay, because we're going to have to start engineering this planet. We're going to have to stop population increasing, and come up with high-tech solutions to regulate the temperature of this planet somehow. And I just don't see. We're just reading how taxes and you're not going to do it with solar and wind. It'll help, but you're not going to get there. So. I'd kind of like to see you cut to the chase, and start talking about solutions.
Well, I will get there. You just give me some time. I mean, I'm supposed to talk until 12 o'clock, so let me finish my talk, please. Okay? All right. So basically, this is an externality that all these people getting mercury poisoning are not. The coal companies aren't paying for their medical bills. This is something that we are absorbing as a cost. And so this is very clear. I'm actually surprised at how few people know about this. But the bulk of mercury pollution in the atmosphere is coming from fossil fuel consumption. Okay, there's mining and other things that contribute to this. Okay, so in China, they have now realized, you've seen all those pictures of how you can't see in China anymore across Beijing. So the Chinese government has now admitted, this is official Chinese government numbers, that the cost of environmental degradation in China was about 230 billion in 2010, or 3.5% of the gross national product. Okay, people have estimated that outdoor air pollution contributed to 1.2 premature deaths in China in 2010. Okay, if you look at the pollution scale, it goes from 0 to 500. Well, they have recorded numbers of 755 on that scale of 0 to 500, which is pretty amazing. There have been reports saying that expats, Americans or foreigners that work in China, are now leaving China because the pollution is so bad they worry about their kids. Okay? So that's how bad it's gotten in China. And so the argument is between free marketers who say the government should not be telling us to do, we don't need regulations, industry will control itself. Well, then you look at what's happening in China, where they have had more of a free market system than we have, and you can see that it's now coming back to bite them. All right? This is Munich Re, which is a reinsurance company. This is the insurance company that insures insurance companies. So both Swiss Re and Munich Re have come out very strongly saying that, here you go, Munich Re, one of the world's largest, wrote, the only plausible explanation for the rise in weather-related catastrophes is climate change. Okay, so this is actually the cost of, unfortunately this screen is not very, so in 2010 there were 247 events. The total cost of weather-related disasters was $250 billion in 2010. Okay? All right, so here's one solution. I actually work on a project for geoengineering, okay? We're trying to, this small group of volunteer scientists is trying to spray salt up into the atmosphere to create clouds to reflect back more of the sunlight. Okay, so I'm not going to talk very much about this because I do want to get to some other solutions. But what people have discovered is that after we have these big volcanoes like Pinatubo, the Earth cools for a couple of years. And that's due to sulfur being emitted in the atmosphere, and that sulfur reflects sunlight back. So there are actually serious proposals to take planes and put millions of tons of sulfur up in the stratosphere. Okay, now we've been doing geoengineering for 120 years and it's not going too well. So by putting all this CO2 in the atmosphere, the problem is that you don't know if you're going to get it right. Who's going to be responsible if we screw it up? You know, if we cause acid rain that destroys the forests, or if we cause freak storms that we didn't anticipate, or, you know, how are we going to know that this is... So I'm working on this research project because there are people that are convinced that humans are not going to wake up in time to solve this problem. So we need to have something in our back pocket to basically cool the Earth. And that would be something as drastic as putting millions of tons of sulfur up in the atmosphere. Okay? I think it's pretty scary, but we should at least do the research. Okay? What they've estimated, 1 kilogram of well-placed sulfur in the stratosphere will roughly offset the warming effect of several 100,000 kilograms of carbon dioxide. Okay, the problem with this is it does not do anything about ocean acidification. We're still pumping the CO2 in the atmosphere that's dissolving in the oceans, making it more acidic, making all of the sea life die. Okay, it's not going to solve that problem. It's just going to cool the Earth. So that is scary, what it's going to do, what adding CO2 is going to do to the oceans. Okay? So this book, she outlines, I mean, this took 5 years to research this book, okay? And she outlines the same cast of characters involved in all these denial campaigns, whether it was acid rain or ozone or DDT or tobacco. And she tries to get to the crux of it, is why do you have these super smart people, these PhDs that worked on the Manhattan Project, physicists, This guy was former president of the National Academy of Sciences. This guy was a director at the Weather Satellite Services. This was a director at, this guy, Bill Nierenberg, a director at Scripps. I mean, what drives these guys to deny, climate change? And fundamentally, it comes down to two things. One is money, and these guys may not be driven by money. Certainly the Koch brothers are not driven by necessarily trying to increase their wealth. I don't know them, but they each have $42 billion. I don't really see the point in their getting richer. But so there's two things. One is money and one is ideology. There are all of these think tanks that are free market think tanks, and they think that government should have no role, just let the free market decide what technologies to pick and so on. So it turns out that the Koch brothers' father had worked in the Soviet Union, as I described, and he hated communism. He had a passionate antipathy towards Stalin and communism. And he apparently passed that on to his sons, who are staunch free marketers. So they fund free market think tanks, and they fund denier groups, and so on. But their ideology is just that any regulation is a slippery slope to government control over everything in your lives, okay? For example, our whole economy is based on fossil fuels. So fossil fuels is in practically everything we do. If the government starts controlling fossil fuels, then they control our whole lives. This is their argument. This is the free marketer argument, is that this is a slippery slope. Any regulation is a slippery slope to communism, okay? And, they have this view, but we've looked at externalities. These free marketers don't account for externalities. They don't pay for the cost of all of these health effects, okay? So Gus Speth, who's an environmentalist, says most environmental degradation is the result of failures of capitalism that we have today. Okay, you can look at the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. You can look at CO2 levels. You can look at extinctions. We're in the 6th mass extinction right now. Okay, Nicholas Stern, former head of the World Bank, says climate change is the greatest and widest ranging market failure ever seen. Okay, so this is this counter argument to these staunch free marketers. Okay, and those are basically the two philosophies that she boils this down to. Is CEOs have an obligation to maintain shareholder value, so they will lobby or do whatever it takes to maintain shareholder value. And then you have these other people, like these guys, super smart guys who these guys are cold warriors. They actually worked on the Manhattan Project. They have this ideology of everything closely associated with communism is, incredibly bad. We need to avoid any slide down the path to communism, which includes socialism and everything else. Okay, so one thing you can do is you can buy green power. Okay, Palo Alto actually has the highest rate. We at our household, we pay 20%, 15% extra for our electricity, Silicon Valley Power, to make sure that all the electricity we get is carbon free, okay? And we have a plug-in Prius, and then when I charge that up, then I'm really carbon free. So, all right. Palo Alto, in its wisdom, I give them a lot of credit, have actually decided, because Palo Alto owns its own utility, have decided to make that whole utility carbon free. Okay, and it's actually unbelievably retroactive. So they passed this in March, and they made it retroactive, which, how could they do that? How could they grab that carbon back and stick it back in the ground? Well, what they did was they looked at what their emissions were, and they buy these things called renewable energy credits, which are credits that people get for planting trees that remove carbon, or building windmills or solar farms, and that you get this credit. If you put solar on your house, you can actually sell credits to Palo Alto, well, to somebody, for the carbon that you're offsetting, okay? So Palo Alto's plan has 2 phases. The city will purchase these RECs until they can install or have contracts for more solar and wind. And then long term, they will raise the rates up to ½ cent per kilowatt hour, which is not very much, I think, but it's a start, until they start decarbonizing the utility generation, okay? So one of the, we talked about externalities, and the idea is that you want to include the environmental degradation in the cost of the products that you're buying. So I'm in this group called Citizens Climate Lobby, and we advocate very strongly for a carbon tax. This means that every lump of coal, when it comes out of the ground, it gets taxed at $15 a ton, increasing by $10 a ton, which is a very predictable rate. Businesses can just plan for it in their business strategies, okay? Right when it comes out of the ground, we tax it. Now, of course, the coal company is not going to eat that cost. They're going to pass it on to when they sell the coal to the electric company, and that's going to pass it on to the consumers. So your electricity rates will go up, your gas prices will go up, because everyone's passing along these taxes, right? This carbon price. But what we propose is we take every penny of that, put in a fund, and return it back to consumers. So any pinch that you felt at the gas pump will be returned to you. So you won't feel the pinch of that gas tax unless you drive a Hummer. Because if you drove a Hummer, let's say $100 a ton adds $1 to the cost of gasoline. A Hummer driving 15,000 miles will spend an extra $1,368 per year. The Prius driver driving the same will only spend $300. If you got that dividend check back at the end of the year, it happened to be $700. As a Prius driver, you make money. As a Hummer driver, you pay for all that pollution that you're causing. So you're building in that price to people who consume more. Does that make sense to people? This is... No. It does, because if you're a Hummer driver, when gas prices went up, Hummer went out of business and people switched to smaller cars. If we had $7 a gas, we would not have big SUVs, trust me. We would be like Europe. We would definitely be like Europe. Okay, so the other thing that it does is that a electric company that wants to sell you electricity, they have a choice of buying coal power or buying wind power. As I said, coal power is 7 cents, wind power is 14 cents. But if you price the coal, wind power becomes more attractive to the electric utility. So they will start buying more wind power. And investors will start building more windmills because they know they can sell their power at a certain rate. So it changes consumer choices. Energy is way too cheap for the amount of degradation we're doing to the environment. It's just far too cheap. Europe, other countries have, I think, priced it more appropriately. I think it should be even higher considering the cost of climate change. But we need, this is the fairest way to do it. What happens is, because you're returning it all back to consumers, the government doesn't say what happens to that money. You don't bet on Solyndra. You don't bet on any particular technology, right? It's a free market solution that people can accept. Okay, I just want to go into 2 more slides and then I'm done. One thing I talked about was divestment. There are a few universities that have already almost committed to divesting their pension funds and their endowments from fossil fuel companies, seeing that potentially the share value of fossil fuel companies will go down as we legislate prices on carbon. One thing you can look at is the corruption of our political system by money. 90% of Americans supported expanding background checks recently. When the Senate voted, they couldn't get 60% of senators. So here you have 90% versus 60%. So why is that? Because of invested interests. You had gun dealers, gun manufacturers, the NRA, you had this huge lobbying effort where our representatives are no longer representing the people. Okay, and that's what's happening with carbon legislation, with environmental legislation. You have these well-funded, $113 billion Koch brothers who have undue influence. Okay, so these are a couple of things. We want to change the political system, how politics are funded. You can see that the donors, we had this Prop 23 that tried to reverse AB 32. The big funders to that were Valero, $4 million in Tesoro oil refineries. And then here's the Koch brothers showing up again, funding Prop 23. So there's a California Disclose Act, which requires political ads to disclose their donors. Move to amend is to amend the Constitution, declaring corporations as not people. Here's an example of if we really wanted to do something, this is my last slide, we could. So in World War II, we had this threat, this external threat. We got bombed by the Japanese in Pearl Harbor. We decided to do something about it, okay? So Roosevelt proposed building 60,000 planes, 45,000 tanks, and 20,000 anti-aircraft guns. Not a single automobile was built between 1942 and 1945. We went from 4 million cars in 1941 to 0. Tires, gasoline, fuel oil were all rationed. Look at what we were able to accomplish if we put our minds to it. We built 300,000 aircraft, 80,000 tanks, 2.8 million military trucks, 2.6 million machine guns, and 5,000 ships in 3 years. So if we wanted to do something, we could do something. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
So we've got about 5 minutes for questions. So I see 2 at the back and 1 at the front. I'll go. And okay, 4. That's a minute each.
Okay.
It seems to me what we really need, this is a tremendously important issue. This threatens civilization.
Yes.
Maybe one of the two, maybe the only other thing that competes with this is the nuclear weapons issue. And we need greater public understanding and knowledge about this. But this is my question. If I'm going to say something to somebody in a minute, I'm not sure what exactly I should say. I think I should say 97% of climatologists say global warming is real and it's caused by human activity. And secondly, the fossil fuels are the big problem. Coal, and those are 2 major things that people need to understand. So in a short explanation, what else could I say besides those 2? I mean, I can't say everything you've said. There's no way. I'm not going to ask somebody to read a book. I want to say something, I mean, what I call an elevator speech, so that people can get the main point, And that's what we need in society.
Yes. So what I would do.
What else would I say?
Well, I would go back to Bill McKibben. So I really like Bill McKibben's stuff. So he basically has boiled it down to this Rolling Stone article, which is these 6 numbers that you want to remember. Okay, that we need to be below 2 degrees. We are emitting 32 billion tons of carbon, which is a greenhouse gas. We cannot burn more than 600 tons of carbon, which gives us 20 years to be completely off of carbon. Does that make sense? Well, the problem is all you can say is that we need, climate change is real. The deniers are funded by oil companies and people who have vested interests or ideological interests. And we have to change our whole economy to get off of carbon.
Yeah. I'm Andrea Dory, and I have a question for you. PG&E found out that I'm now driving an electric vehicle, in addition to my Honda Insight, which was rated 60 to 71 miles per gallon, but no way to plug it in. It was the first on the road. Well, the PG&E called me up and they said, would you like to be connected to this new system where you get a special meter and there's 2 different stages and all this kind of thing. And of course the Electric Auto Association, which I belong to, has been talking about it. So what I want to ask you is this. Is that meter connected to this carbon situation where we're paying a little more, but because we're using less?
Yes, if you negotiate with, if you just sign up, check the little box saying, I want green power, all of your electrons, they can't really sort them out, but they'll buy renewable energy credits to cover you. But my wife's girlfriend, they got a Tesla, and they got one of those meters, and at night, they're paying 3.3 cents per kilowatt hour through PG&E. So.
Yes, 1/3 of the normal rate. Yeah.
It's actually probably even,
Fourth,
depends on
yeah.
what tier you're in.
It's
If you're
cheap.
in a high tier of PG&E, you're paying 30 cents a
Right. It's
kilowatt
very,
hour.
very cheap.
Yeah.
Hi, my name's Dan. I think I can proudly say I'm the most right-wing and most libertarian member of this group that comes frequently, certainly among those who ask questions. I watch a lot, I read people like Reason Magazine, Nick Gillespie, Matt Welsh, listen sometimes to somebody like Penn Jillette. These people are not stupid.
Right.
They are, I'm absolutely sure, aware of everything you said today. So, and by the way, this sort of more intellectual libertarian side of the conservative people in the U.S. are quite unhappy with the Republican Party and are splitting with them on neoconservative, American adventurism. I think they could split on this, but I want to understand why they haven't yet. And what are the dynamics, if you understand it at all? But I'm very curious about the dynamics in the right wing, sort of the more intellectual conservatives who must know what's really going on and understand that eventually, and I understand it sort of ideologically fights a little bit against their capitalism, but the point of externalities, that's fundamentally a libertarian capitalist argument that could be made on the right.
And that's why Citizens Climate Lobby makes that. They say this is something free marketers can be on board with, because, well, within the Republican Party, the log cabin Republicans have been shouted down for a long time. The Tea Partier has undue influence on, you have, people that aren't paying their child support being elected to Congress. It's crazy what's happened to the Republican Party, and they're really in crisis mode right now.
It's bad because you want a strong opposition party.
You do.
With at least a faction that you might agree with.
Yeah.
You don't have that. So it
Right.
makes it almost impossible to think of this.
So could you repeat what Dan's saying?
Okay. He was just saying that you want to have a two-party system. The Republican Party is in total disarray, that if you don't have that balance against, say, the what do they call it? The environmentalists that are green leaves with red shoots, with red roots, the communist aspect of environmentalism. So I totally believe that we should have more than a two-party system, but we happen to have a two-party system. But part of it is just the funding of our elections. It's totally broken. You have to raise $3 million to run for Senate. Where are you going to get that money? I go to Washington to lobby at my own expense, pay my own ticket, my own hotel fare for Citizens Climate Lobby, and I see these Congress people, and they're constantly chasing the dollar to get reelected. I mean, it's a broken system.
Hi,
Yes.
I got two micro questions. The first one is regarding smoking. I don't smoke, but I was just wondering if people that smoke cigars are less likely to have cancer than the ones that smoke cigarettes. And the other question, which I think I wouldn't have had to ask it if you had been interrupted, which is, does tuna, if it part of the problem is that it comes in cans?
No, the issue with tuna fish is that mercury is bioaccumulative. So plankton will absorb mercury, And then vegetarian fish will eat plankton. And, you know, a 10-pound fish will probably have eaten 100 pounds of food in its lifetime. And all the while it's accumulating that mercury in its body. Then you take a carnivorous fish like tuna, which is eating the vegetarian fish, which is accumulating more mercury. So you want to eat lower on the food chain. If you're going to eat fish, eat the vegetarian fish because they're accumulating less mercury. Does that make sense? This cigar, I don't know. I think they don't do very many studies because so few people smoke cigars. But, you know, cigarettes, the issue is the tar that's in the cigarettes. And they have filters and they have unfiltered cigarettes and, you know, all of that. I can't say. I just know, yeah.
Hi, Martin says we just have a minute or two here, but I was just thinking a possible useful addition to your great presentation would be talking about how horrible things will be if we don't limit carbon, to say how many hundreds of millions of people will die, you know, to motivate this effort to reduce carbon.
There's this guy, Andrew Guzman, who's a lawyer at UC Berkeley, and he wrote this book called Overheated. He just released a study saying he estimates 300 million people will die by 2100 because of climate change effects. 300 million.
Well, on that cheerful note, lunch is ready. Thank you very much.
So the other thing is that if any of you are educators or in the schools, the National Academies of Science have put out this booklet and this CD, which I was able to get for $1 a piece, that you can try to get into the schools or get to a teacher or someone to counteract what Exxon is doing with their curriculum. So,
Thank you.
okay.